Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere a little grim. But don't worry, you're already doomed. You stand before the outer gates of Baghdad. And the first thing you notice is how the sunrise flickers across thousands of dusty footprints. Stamped into the earth like faded signatures, the bricks stretch higher than your imagination cares to measure. Each layer laid centuries ago by hands you'll never know, and somehow it feels they're all judging you in unison. The guards don't look particularly thrilled to see you. One squints at your shoes, the other at your face, as if deciding which seems more untrustworthy. You clear your throat. But your voice is swallowed up by the morning swell of merchants and mules clattering over the threshold. A fine powder of dried mud and camel dung gusts up round your ankles, coating your skin in a film you will not succeed in wiping off. You hand over the small wooden token you were told would grant passage, a sliver of walnut with an official seal pressed so deeply into it, you suspect it might leave an imprint on your palm forever. The guard mutters something you don't catch, and for a tense heartbeat you wonder if they'll drag you off to a holding cell because you failed to bribe the correct person. Then, with a bored wave, they let you pass. That's it. Your grand entrance into the world's most dazzling city, more of a reluctant shrug than a triumphant welcome. The avenue beyond the gate ripples with life, traders hawking baskets of salt fish, children shrieking as they chase each other between columns, travelers with faces set in the same stunned expression you feel tightening across your own. The air tastes like cinnamon and old sweat. If you thought your journey was over, surprise, the real ordeal has only just begun. You clutch your little satchel tighter. It contains everything you in one spare tunic. A crust of bread so stale you could use it to sand furniture. And the nagging conviction you've made a terrible mistake. The breeze teases the hem of your tunic, which you suddenly realize is still damp from last night's rainstorm. Of course it is. The universe has decided you will attend this banquet with the aroma of mildew wafting gently. Behind you, historians still argue whether these colossal gates were more symbolic than defensive. But standing here, you're fairly sure they exist mostly to humiliate newcomers like you. You try to act nonchalant as a caravan of wealthy merchants thunders by in lacquered carts, the wheels hissing over the flagstones, the drivers never once glancing in your direction. You, meanwhile, can't help staring at their crisp robes, their polished beards, their impossibly smug expressions. You shuffle forward with the others, crossing beneath the enormous arch. The noise surges into your ears, 100 conversations in languages you don't recognize, 1,000 transactions you can't afford. It feels like your brain is being massaged and bruised at the same time. Remember that damp tunic? It's still there, hugging your ribs with all the enthusiasm of a wet sponge dot as you ease deeper into the city. A cat the size of a small dog weaves between your legs and nearly trips you. You lurch sideways, mumbling an apology as if the cat might answer. The creature flicks its tail and saunters off, presumably to find someone more dignified to pester dot in the distance. You glimpse the first sunlit minarets, their glazed tulle shimmering like dragon scales. You'd admire them more if your stomach wasn't already fluttering with dread about the banquet to come. You're expected to blend in with nobles and scholars, to show appropriate gratitude for an invitation you never requested. You'd feel better if you could first have a nap, or at least a bath, but neither luxury seems likely. You pause to let a donkey cart rattle past, its driver calling out something that sounds suspiciously insulting. The donkey's tail swishes against your thigh, smearing a fresh line of dust across your clothes. You sigh and carry on, trying not to think about your bed back home thin as it was. It never demanded you memorize 5 dozen social rules just to earn a meal. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but so are your neighbors, so maybe that's fair. You're here. You remind yourself, you're in Baghdad, It's the 9th century. Give or take, and your prospects for surviving this day without catastrophic embarrassment are about as promising as your crust of bread. With each step toward the heart of the city, you feel the atmosphere tighten round. You like the moment you step into a silent elevator and everyone inside has already decided you don't belong. You adjust your satchel and try not to look anyone in the eye. It doesn't help. Every glance you catch seems to pin you in place, measuring your worth and finding it a little thin. You think about turning back, but the gates behind you have swallowed you up, and besides, you've already used your one scrap of credibility getting in. So you breathe, and you walk, and you remind yourself that tonight's banquet is why you came all this way. Whether you leave it a little wiser or just a little more exhausted is something you'll have to discover for yourself. You keep moving, though your legs are beginning to ache from hours on the road. The bazaar sprawls before you in a tangle of canopies, each stitched from cloth so vibrant you suspect it was designed specifically to embarrass the drab linen draped over your shoulders. Merchants bellow out prices, praises, and curses with the same booming cheer. You step aside to let a woman pass, balancing a tray piled high with dates, their skins glistening like polished leather. Your stomach growls, reminding you that the only meal you've had today was that fossilized bread, still lodged somewhere in your throat. You edge past a row of pottery stands. The jars are stacked so precariously that one clumsy elbow would send hundreds of diners crashing to the ground, and naturally, you feel your elbow twitch with a sudden and helpful desire to test this theory. You squeeze your arms to your sides and focus on your feet, trying not to look too obviously overwhelmed. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but at least in this century, nobody expects you to post your humiliation online. A scent of roasted lamb and warm honey wafts through the air, mingling with something far less delicious, maybe donkey, maybe centuries of unwashed paving stones. You can't tell. Historians still argue whether these bazaars were truly the pinnacle of civilization's trade networks or just elaborate excuses to charge extra for spices. All you know is that you've never seen so many goods crammed into one place. Boats of silk shimmering like liquid, brass lamps catching the sun, ivory combs carved into delicate shapes you can't imagine surviving an actual hairdo. Remember that damp tunic? It's soaking up every stray smell as you wander past stall after stall. You pause at a display of glinting copper pots, wondering if buying one might make you look less like a vagrant and more like an invited guest. But the merchant's raised eyebrow suggests even thinking about touching the merchandisers. Offensive, you mumble an apology and shuffle along, face worn dot further down the lane. A group of boys darts between shoppers, tossing a leather ball back and forth. One nearly collides with your knee, and you jerk sideways into a barrel that coughs up a puff of cinnamon powder, instantly coating your eyebrows and the tip of your nose. A few passers-by glance over, lips twitching, but nobody offers help. You blink through the sweet-smelling haze, resigned to the fact you'll now arrive at the banquet looking like a failed pastry. The bazaar branches into narrow alleys, each more crowded than the last. You slip down one that promises a shortcut, though in truth it feels more like a labyrinth designed to test your last shred of patience. A tanner's shop spills its sour stench into the corridor, and your eyes water. You step round a pile of discarded skins, trying not to gag. Historians still argue whether leather preparation was considered an honorable craft or simply the least glamorous necessity of a city this size. At last, you spot a cluster of servants in crisp tunics, standing near a low table stacked with sealed scrolls. You squint, trying to read the labels without obviously gawking. Your heart thumps. Maybe your invitation is somewhere in that pile, of course. Finding it will require approaching the servant who looks least interested in helping. You clear your throat, Then cough when a swirl of tanner's dust sneaks into your lungs. The nearest servant glances up with an expression that lands somewhere between curiosity and annoyance. You swallow, gesturing vaguely at the scrolls. He doesn't say a word, just plucks a rolled parchment from the stack, weighs it in his palm, and hands it over as if he's certain you'll ruin whatever event you're attending. You try to thank him, but he's already turned away to address someone more important. You cradle the scroll in both hands. It's smaller than you expected. Wrapped with a strip of blue silk so soft it makes your fingertips tingle, the seal is stamped in dark wax, a crescent and 3 tiny dots, the emblem you've seen on every corner banner since you stumbled through the gates. This is it. Your official pass to the banquet, confirmation you're not just an aimless drifter. At least not entirely. You unroll it slightly to peek at the contents. But the script curls and shivers in your grip, refusing to cooperate. The words might as well be an elaborate prank, so elegantly penned you can't tell which line is your name and which is the polite way to say you'll be asked to leave if you spill anything on the carpet. You roll it back up with care, though not, before a smudge of cinnamon dust stamps itself across the bottom. Of course it does. You straighten your back, trying to look like someone who receives these invitations all the time. You fail. Every step you take feels marked by invisible arrows pointing out exactly how misplaced you are. You're keenly aware of every scrape on your sandals, every damp fold of your tunic, every crumb of stale bread clinging to your sleeve. Remember that bread. It's still there, a silent witness to your escalating discomfort. You walk on. Past a bookseller's stand with thick tomes, sprawl open, pages fluttering in the breeze like wounded birds. A bearded scholar argues with the merchant, voice rising and falling in a rhythm that makes your heartbeat stutter. Historians still argue whether the Abbasid scribes charged fairly for copying these manuscripts, or if each commission was a discreet fortune. All you know is that you could never afford even a single page. You hurry along, hoping no one notices you gawking. But of course they do, the longer you linger. The more I seem to find you, some curious, some indifferent, if you openly. Amused, you square your shoulders, clutch your precious scroll, and step into the nearest avenue, praying this one will finally lead to somewhere less suffocating instead. You're met with a fresh wave of humanity. Jugglers in bright sashes, a row of barbers hacking away at beards with unsettling enthusiasm, a line of women balancing jars of water atop their heads as if physics were a mild suggestion. A donkey brays behind you, startling you forward. The scroll nearly slips from your grasp. You catch it just in time, heart hammering. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but honestly, you'd trade 3 of these dusty alleys for a single GPS ping to tell you where you're going. You push ahead, determined to find the street that leads to the banquet hall. The crowd presses tighter. The smell of baking bread teases your empty stomach again. Cruel as any insult, you keep your eyes forward, trying to pretend you're perfectly at ease, that you belong here, that you've always belonged here. But you know better, and so does everyone else. You step out of the press of the bazaar, into a crooked lane paved in irregular tiles that bite the soles of your feet through the thin leather of your sand. Dulls, for a moment, the world seems quieter. Here, though you can still hear the rattle and roar of commerce behind you, you're clutching the invitation so tightly your knuckles have blanched to a ghostly hue. At least nobody in this lane seems interested in your arrival. A scrawny cat is your only witness as you gather a shivering breath and try to remember why you thought any of this was a good idea. You adjust your satchel and press on. Following a narrow ribbon of shade that curls along the wall. Above you, laundry flutters from wooden poles like surrender flags. You duck your head to avoid a sheet drifting into your face, but it brushes your cheek anyway, damp, fragrant with soap, and vaguely accusatory. as if to remind you that you haven't washed your tunic in a week. You keep walking. The lane empties you into a quieter square, where an old fountain gurgles a half-hearted trickle of water. Here, the servants wait in a loose cluster, each one bearing the same blue silk crap scroll you now cradle like a fragile elm. One of them, a lean man with a half-healed burn across his forearm, glances up as you approach. He studies your face, then the dusty hem of your garment, then the faint cinnamon smudge on your invitation. His expression doesn't change, but his eyebrows inch a fraction higher, as if filing away your inadequacies for later reference. You clear your throat, but he speaks first, though speaks is generous. He mumbles a word you don't catch and gestures with his chin at a low table lined with delicate porcelain ink pots. You gather he expects you to confirm your name, carefully. You unroll your invitation again, trying not to crease the silk ribbon further, and point to the line that seems most likely to contain your identity. The servant sighs, dabs a reed pen in the nearest ink pot, and inscribes a brisk note in a ledger you hadn't noticed tucked under his elbow. Historian still. Argue whether these invitation registries were genuine security measures or simply a way to intimidate guests into good behavior. You suspect it's the latter. Given the servant's look of weary disdain as he waves you past, you nod, trying to project the air of a person who is definitely meant to be here. Definitely not an interloper clutching a crumpled scroll and a stale scrap of bread. You step round the table, and the servant's voice follows you low and toneless as he rattles off directions in Arabic far too quick for you to process. You pause, halfway through an uncertain nod, but he's already turned to the next rival, and you're left to puzzle it out alone. You drift toward the far edge of the square, where the shadow of an ornate arch stretches across the stones. Beyond it lies a courtyard paved with patterned tiles so intricate they seem designed to trip you into admiration and then into the nearest water basin. You linger at the threshold, hoping someone else will lead the way, but nobody spares you a second glance. With a final look over your shoulder just in case this is all an elaborate test you're about to fail, you step beneath the arch. The air changes, cooler here, shaded by the latticework above. A stray breeze tugs at your damp tunic, reminding you yet again that you're arriving in less than regal condition. You resist the urge to smooth your hair, knowing it will only emphasize how little you belong. You cross the courtyard in slow steps. In the center, a shallow pool reflects a cluster of date palms, their fronds rippling with each sigh of wind. You catch sight of your own reflection in the water wan, anxious, smudged with cinnamon, and quickly look away. Ahead, a row of servants stands in two disciplined lines, each holding a lacquered tray. You inch closer, pretending you know precisely what to expect. As you approach, one steps forward, offering you a thin scrap of linen folded into a perfect square. You take it, bewildered. The servant tilts his head toward a smaller basin set discreetly by the wall. After a moment's blankness, you realize this must be your chance to rinse the grime of your journey, though you doubt any ceremonial hand-washing can salvage your dignity at this point. Remember that damp tunic. It's now joined by damp hands. You dab at your fingers, trying not to drip water on the invitation you still clutch. You wish you had somewhere safe to stash it, but your satchel is already stuffed to bursting, and you're fairly certain tucking it into your waistband will not inspire confidence. You settle for rolling it tightly again and pinning it between your palm and your ribs as you move along the line. The next servant offers a sprig of something green and pungent mint, maybe, or some local herb you can't name. You hesitate, then accept it, trying not to betray your confusion. The servant's face gives away nothing, and you suspect he's had years of practice in concealing judgment. You stand there, holding your mint leaf and your scroll and your rising sense of dread, when another figure steps forward, a tall, real thin steward in a robe that gleams like polished onyx. Without a word, he extends an envelope of heavy parchment sealed with more of that dark wax. His fingers brush yours, cold and dry as old paper. This, you realize, is the final confirmation. The formal invitation within your informal invitation though. One that proves you're not just another wanderer looking for free bread and a story to tell. You incline your head in what you hope is an appropriate gesture of thanks. Though your heart thuds against your ribs so violently you have expect the steward to notice, historians still argue whether these layered invitations were a matter of security or simply a flex by the host, an elegant way to remind everyone that belonging here was never guaranteed. You step back, both hands full, and nearly trip over the edge of the pool. Your sandal splashes into the shallows, soaking your toes in a burst of cold. You manage not to yelp, but the sudden chill makes you inhale sharply, and the steward's expression doesn't flicker. Perhaps this happens often. Perhaps you're merely the latest in a long line of bumbling aspirants fumbling their way toward polite society. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But at least nobody is live streaming your misadventure. You edge along the pool's curve, finally reaching the far archway that promises entry to the main hall. You pause there, catching your breath. The last glimmers of daylight are fading, and the courtyard is beginning to glow with lanterns, rows of them, strung high above the tiles, their flames dancing in the rising dusk. The effect is almost enough to make you forget the damp fabric, clinging to your ankles, the cinnamon on your cheek, the bruised ache in your soles. Almost, you take one last look at the envelope, weighing its promise against the certainty that tonight will be more ordeal than celebration. Then you lift your chin and step inside. Because there is no other way forward, the passage narrows into a corridor paneled with cedar. The walls close enough that your elbows occasionally graze polished wood. You try not to think about the thousands of hands that have pressed along these panels, all more confident than yours. The scent of burning incense drifts round your head sharp, resinous, so thick you almost taste it. You adjust your grip on the envelope, hoping you don't look as lost as you feel. After a few more paces, you emerge into a small antechamber. A cluster of servants stands waiting, each holding a folded garment in shades of cream, blue, or garnet. Their eyes flick over you, and before you can speak, one steps forward with the air of someone who has been dreading this task all day. He extends an armful of soft blue silk so fine it shimmers when you shift your weight and gestures for you to take it. You hesitate. Somewhere in your brain, a little voice insists you should decline and run for the exit before anyone realizes you're an imposter. But that voice is easily overpowered by the larger voice reminding you that you haven't come all this way to turn back now. You slip the envelope into your satchel, gulp once, and accept the bundle. The servant gestures toward a carved screen. Its lattice work dense enough to provide modest privacy. You shuffle behind it, trying not to imagine the many dignitaries who have undressed in this same cramped space. You peel off your travel-stained tunic, the damp cloth clinging one last time before falling in a heap. Underneath, your skin prickles in the cool air, raw where the rough fabric has been chafing your ribs since dawn. Historians still argue whether Abbasid hosts provided garments like this as a courtesy or a subtle humiliation, an elegant way to remind guests that their own clothes were never quite good enough. You try not to dwell on it as you shake out the silk robe. It glitters in the lamplight, the color of late evening sky. You slip it over your head, half expecting it to disintegrate at your touch. But it settles round your shoulders with improbable gentleness, as if forgiving you for your many inadequacies. You run your palms along the seams, marveling at how something can feel both so luxurious and so alien. It drapes nearly to your ankles, the sleeves cut wide enough to swallow your hands. You tug at the sash, tightening it in a knot that will probably come loose at the worst possible moment. Remember that stale bread in your satchel? It's still there, the least dignified part of your ensemble. You gather your other belongings and step out from behind the screen. The servant studies you a moment, then inclines his head reluctantly, acknowledging that you've become marginally more presentable. He gestures toward a smaller door set into the far wall. For one absurd second, you imagine stepping through it to find your own bed waiting on the other side, soft and clean and blessedly quiet instead. You square your shoulders and follow where he points. The door yields to a silent push, and you step into a hallway paved in patterned marble. The torches flicker low, their smoke seeping across the ceiling in lazy curls. Your new robe swishes on your ankles, and for a fleeting moment you almost feel like you belong here. Almost. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But the good news is, you're unlikely to get any awkward notifications about the state of your overdraft while you're navigating this maze. At the far end of the hall, a pair of attendants stands guard beside an archway framed by gilt designs, delicate vines and stylized calligraphy. The attendants don't smile. They don't even blink. They simply watch you approach with identical expressions of polite expectation. You bow your head, unsure whether this is correct protocol. And one of them steps aside to hold the curtain open. You step through, breathing as steadily as you can manage. And there it is, the courtyard you've been imagining all day. Only now, instead of sunlight, it's bathed in the glow of dozens of bronze lanterns. Their flames float in the darkness like captive stars. At least 6 fountains bubble in the corners, their soft music blending with the rustle of palm leaves. Overhead, the air is cooler here, perfumed with something faintly sweet rose water. You guess, though it's laced with an undercurrent of damp stone. You stand for a moment, overwhelmed. Then you remember you're supposed to keep moving. A servant drifts forward, so quiet he seems conjured from the shadows, and gestures for you to cross the tiled floor toward a small table near the central fountain. There, another steward waits, this one in a deep indigo robe embroidered with tiny silver crescents. He doesn't speak. He simply extends his hand for your envelope. Your heart does a nervous flip, but you surrender it, praying you haven't committed some obscure offense. He breaks the wax seal with one quick motion and unrolls the parchment. You watch his eyes flick across the lines of script. Historians still argue whether these final checks were meant to ensure security or to observe which guests would crumble under the scrutiny. You do your best to appear unperturbed, though you suspect your face is betraying every anxious thought currently warring behind your eyes. Finally, the steward rolls the parchment closed, tucks it into a wooden case at his side, and inclines his head. You're in. No ceremony, no announcement, just a faint nod that leaves you feeling more exposed than ever. Remember that damp tunic you left behind the screen? You almost miss it now. A servant gestures toward a smaller archway, lined with tall oil lamps. You pass beneath it, into a corridor where the air grows warmer, the scents richer. Somewhere ahead, you hear the low, melodic hum of a flute. You keep walking, each step a little more surreal, as if you're slipping deeper into a story you haven't quite agreed to join. You follow the hall until it ends at a broad set of carved doors, thrown wide to reveal the grand hall itself. It glows with hundreds of tiny flames lamps, candles, lanterns, each reflecting off polished brass and tile mosaics until the air seems alive with trembling light. Your eyes can't settle anywhere for long. Pillows and carpets spill across the floor, and every surface seems layered in gold, silk, or both. A hush ripples through the nearest group of guests as you step across the threshold. You can feel their gazes weighing you, cataloging every mismatched detail. You remind yourself, you're wearing their robe now. You are holding no sign of your ordinary life. You take a slow breath, then another, and step forward into the brightness. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but at least you won't have to text anyone updates about how out of place you feel. You step fully into the grand hall, and for a few heartbeats, you forget to breathe. Light pours across every surface, gilded screens, hammered brass platters. Low tables inlaid with swirling patterns so fine you suspect the craftsmen went half-blind to finish them. The ceiling arches impossibly high above you, a lattice of painted wood and tiny glass panels that catch the lantern glow in fractured rainbows. You blink, dazed, as your vision swims with colored halos. No one rushes forward to greet you. No crier announces your name. You are simply another anonymous guest drifting in, trying not to look overwhelmed. But of course you do. You keep your chin lifted anyway, crossing the threshold as though you've been here 1,000 times before. A servant in pale green appears at your side, as if conjured by your embarrassment, and motions toward a line of low tables. Each one gleams with polished silverware and towering arrangements of fresh herbs. You understand that you're meant to wait here, though for what, you can't guess, so you stand, hands folded neatly, while your heart beats loud enough to drown out the flute music drifting from the far side of the hall. Remember that stale bread in your satchel. It feels like the last vestige of your former life. A tiny ballast in a sea of gold. A procession of attendants begins to cross the hall, bearing tall ewers that steam gently in the lantern light. They pass among the guests, pouring water over, outstretched hands and murmuring something too soft to catch. You watch, trying to memorize every motion, each nod, each delicate gesture, so that when it's your turn, you won't betray your ignorance. Historians still argue whether these ablution rituals were primarily practical or an elaborate theater of courtesy. Watching the water glisten on the guests' fingers, you suspect both are true. When an attendant reaches you, you extend your hands automatically, palms cupped. Warm water sluices across your skin, carrying away the last of the street, dust and possibly any hope of remaining inconspicuous. You bow your head in what you hope is a suitable expression of gratitude, and the attendant departs without meeting your eyes. You glance around for somewhere to sit, but no one offers instruction. A pair of merchants in matching scarlet robes glance at you, then at each other, their faces composed in identical masks of polite curiosity. You realize they're waiting to see whether you know what comes next. You don't, but you're too committed to admit it now. So you step forward and select a cushion at the far edge of the nearest table, lowering yourself. As carefully as you can, the cushion sinks under your weight, pitching you forward just enough to feel absurd. You pretend this was your intention all along, adjusting the folds of your borrowed robe and smoothing your palms over your knees. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but that's probably a mercy. No buzzing reminders to ruin this delicate moment of second-hand splendor. To your left, a woman with a veil of sheer ivory adjusts her bracelets, each clink somehow more refined than your entire existence. She doesn't look at you, but you sense she knows precisely who you are, or at least who you aren't. To your right, a young man with a neatly oiled beard is studying a slip of parchment as though it contains a secret formula for becoming more important. You wonder if he feels any more certain than you do. A hush falls across the hall. From the far archway, a line of servants emerges, each bearing a shallow silver bowl covered with a silk cloth. They move in synchronized steps, their slippers whispering across the tiles. When they reach the tables, they pause as one. Then, in a fluid motion, lift the cloths away. The scent hits you like a physical force, slam braised with spices you can't name, mingled with something sweet and smoky. Your stomach clenches in a pang so sharp you nearly gasp. It has been too long since you ate anything that wasn't half stale. Remember that damp tunic you left behind? You'd almost trade this silk robe to have it back if it meant you could disappear into a simpler life, far from this gleaming pageant. A servant sets a small dish before you, thin bread spread with a pale paste that smells of garlic. And something tangy. You watch out of the corner of your eye as the other guests pick up morsels of bread with careful fingers, dipping them into tiny bowls. You mimic them as best you can, though your movements feel clumsy, too deliberate. Historians still argue whether these first courses were intended as a true meal or merely an overture, a polite suggestion that greater indulgences would soon follow. Judging by the rich, oily sheen on your fingertips, you suspect the latter. You taste the bread. It dissolves on your tongue in a burst of salt and something pungent, almost medicinal. You manage not to grimace, but it's close. The merchant beside you tilts his head as if to confirm your reaction, then returns to his parchment without a word. You try to focus on the intricate tilework beneath your table, a pattern of interlocked stars in lavish and white, but the more you study it, the more it seems to shift and ripple under your gaze. You blink hard, steadying yourself, and take another cautious bite. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but at least you're spared any pop-up ads about luxury travel. A soft music begins to swell behind you, a slow, sighing melody that makes the fine hairs on your neck lift. You turn just enough to glimpse the musician seated on a raised platform. A flautist, a man coaxing warm notes from a long-necked lute, and a woman whose voice curls through the air like incense. You force yourself to breathe in time with the song, hoping it will quiet the nervous tremor in your hands. Round you, the other guests murmur to one another in voices so low you can't catch a word. You feel as if you've been wrapped in a veil of ritual too old to question. Remember your reflection in the courtyard fountain. You suspect you look even more bewildered now, though you can't risk glancing into another pool to confirm it. The bread is gone. A servant reappears to whisk away the empty plate, replacing it with a fresh dish, slivers of roasted eggplant, glistening in oil, scattered with toasted seeds. You fold your hands in your lap, waiting to see whether this is a course you're meant to eat at once or admire in prolonged reverence that no one explains. They never do. You realize, with a slow sinking certainty, that this is the heart of it. Everyone here already knows the rules, and you will always be a little too late to catch up. You ease back a fraction on your cushion, trying to look casual. As the second wave of dishes arrives, more servants appear, each carrying trays piled with delicate ceramic bowls. Their faces are as smooth and impassive as the columns lining the hall. You watch, heart thudding, as each bowl is set before the guests in turn. Steamed lentils flecked with coriander, thin sheets of flat bread folded into perfect triangles. Small ivory spoons for something that glistens like amber in the lamplight. You glance down at your portion, then sideways at your neighbors, trying to guess which item to tackle first. The woman in the ivory veil lifts her spoon with an elegance that makes your own hand feel like a paw. You mimic her as discreetly as you can, scooping up a little of the golden paste. It smells sweet, almost like dried apricots left too long. In the sun, the flavor blooms across your tongue: honey, crushed nuts, a faint bitter note that you can't place. You try to keep your expression neutral, but a small sigh escapes before you can stop it. The merchant beside you glances over, brows lifting a fraction. Whether he's amused or insulted, you can't tell, so you pretend you didn't notice. Historians still argue whether such dishes were prized delicacies or simply creative ways to disguise less than fresh eye. Ingredients you decide you'd rather not know. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but at least you don't have to scroll through other people's perfectly staged dinner photos. A ripple of motion draws your attention to the far side of the hall. Two servants are carrying a broad platter between them so wide it nearly grazes the guests as they pass. On it lies a whole fish, skin burnished to a golden sheen, surrounded by wreaths of herbs and what look suspiciously like pickled lemons. You can't help imagining how a meal like this would have dazzled you in your own time before you spent an hour tripping over yourself in front of half the Abbasid elite. They set the platter on a central dais and step back in unison. A hush falls as if everyone is pausing to acknowledge this moment of collective indulgence. You lower your gaze, uncertain whether to stare or pretend not to notice. Remember that damp tunic you left in the dressing chamber. At least it never demanded you participate in any ceremonies over roasted fish. While everyone's attention is fixed on the main dish, the servant appears beside you. He sets a small brass pitcher and a cup at your elbow, bowing just enough to indicate you should help yourself. You're not hoping it looks confident and poor. The liquid glints pale and translucent, carrying a ghost of anise that tickles your nose. You sip cautiously. Relieved to find it's only lightly spiced water, you force your shoulders to relax. Your stomach is beginning to unknot itself, lulled by warmth and the soft music unfurling across the hall. The lute player has shifted to a slow melody, each note lingering in the smoky air like a sigh. If you close your eyes, you could almost pretend you're just another invited guest, someone who understands precisely which utensil to use and how to keep your robe from sliding off your knee. Almost. The merchant to your right clears his throat softly. You glance over, startled to find he's offering you a small dish of dates, their skins so glossy they reflect the lanterns overhead. You hesitate, wondering whether you're meant to accept or politely decline. But his hand doesn't waver, so you lift the dish with both palms and incline your head in thanks. Historians still argue whether the sharing of dates was an etiquette formality or a genuine gesture of camaraderie. You decide to believe it's the latter. The date yields under your teeth in a burst of sticky sweetness, and you're grateful, if only for the excuse to keep your hands occupied. Remember the cinnamon that stained your cheek in the bazaar. Rub at your face instinctively, half certain there's still a smudge somewhere. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But at least you're spared any news alerts reminding you how thoroughly out of your depth you are. A servant reappears to collect the empty bowls in their place. He sets a fresh dish, small rolls of vine leaves stuffed with something aromatic. You notice the woman in the ivory veil waiting a respectful moment before lifting hers, so you do the same, as though you know precisely why the timing matters when you taste it. You nearly sigh again. The filling is warm and faintly sour, with a whisper of cloves that lingers behind your teeth. You wonder who first decided that vine leaves could be a vessel for such a delicate, improbable flavor. You wonder how many centuries of practice it took to make something so unassuming seem like the pinnacle of refinement. The music swells a little, and conversation hums back to life round you. A pair of dignitaries across the table lean close together, trading observations you can't decipher. You wish, not for the first time, that you spoke the language fluently, though perhaps it's kinder not to understand the speculation about your obvious discomfort. Remember your reflection in the fountain, the one that looked so startled to be here. You suspect it would still be wide-eyed, even after all this ceremony. One of the servants makes a discreet circuit of the hall, adjusting the oil lamps. The shadows on the walls shift, deepening in the corners. The scent of rosewater thickens with each passing minute, mingling with the spices until it becomes its own heavy perfume. You breathe carefully, afraid if you inhale too quickly you'll cough and draw more attention. The merchant to your right has resumed studying his parchment, his face a polite mask of focus. You follow his gaze, if only to look occupied. Though the curling lines of calligraphy make no sense to you, historians still argue whether those scrolls were ledgers, poems, or coded inventories. You suspect any of those would be beyond your comprehension. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but no one is waiting on your reply. That, at least, is its own small mercy. Another dish arrives, a plate of pale, glistening slivers you eventually recognize as melon, dusted with something that might be crushed pistachio. You try not to look too eager as you taste it. The cool sweetness soothes the burn of the spices lingering on your tongue. For a moment, your senses quiet. Then the loop falls silent, and a fresh wave of anticipation ripples round the tables. You realize the main courses have only just begun. Your stomach flips, not quite sure whether it's delight or dread. You brace your hands on your knees, preparing yourself for whatever else this night intends to unfold. You shift carefully on your cushion, feeling the warm weight of all the dishes you've already tasted pressing against your ribs. The servant who brought the melon doesn't return to collect your plate, and you realize this must be the cue that you are now in the main portion of the evening somehow. Everything before was merely a polite prelude. You rub your palms along the edge of your robe, wishing you could find a way to look less obviously out of your element. Remember your reflection, the one by the courtyard fountain. You'd be relieved to know it hasn't witnessed you attempting to unhinge your jaw for the next round of delicacies. A hush falls again as more attendants step into the hall, carrying larger platters, each one draped in silk. The procession is slow this time, with a kind of reverent gravity, as though even the servants are briefly impressed by what they're delivering. One by one, they set the trays on low tables scattered throughout the hall. The aroma that follows is enough to make your eyes sting. A heady mix of roasted meat, warm bread, spices so potent you can feel them settling onto your tongue before you even taste them. Historians still argue whether these main courses were inspired by older Persian traditions or if they were a unique Abbasid flourish. Proof that this court wanted to outdo every rival. As you lean forward to glimpse the contents, you suspect the answer is both. Your stomach, meanwhile, is quietly considering revolt. The silk cloth is lifted. Beneath it, an entire lamb glistens. Burnished skin cracked open to reveal tender meat. Beneath, round it, small dishes hold roasted onions, spiced yogurt is slick of something green that smells bright and sharp. You look discreetly left and right, hoping to see someone else make the first move. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but at least you won't have to text an apology to anyone when you inevitably drop something in your lap. A servant appears at your elbow. He lowers a smaller plate pile with slices already carved, ranged in a spiraling pattern that is so precise you almost don't want to touch it. Almost, your stomach grumbles. The woman in the ivory veil picks up her first piece with her fingertips, folding it delicately into a slip of flatbread. You watch, nodding to yourself like someone who has always known this is the correct technique, and follows suit. The lamb dissolves in your mouth tender, rich, laced with spices you can't name. You almost forget to swallow, caught between pleasure and the sudden fear you're visibly gawking. You set the bread down and inhale as slowly as you can manage. The merchant beside you doesn't look up from his parchment, but you sense he notices everything. Remember that stale crust of bread you brought with you from the road. It feels a world away, and not entirely in a comforting sense. A musician begins a new melody on the lute, soft, spiraling notes that drift along the golden glow of the lanterns. You feel your eyelids flutter, just for a moment, lulled by warmth and exhaustion and the steady churn of too much food into shorter time. But you force yourself awake. If you fall asleep here, you suspect you'll wake to find yourself gently escorted out, or perhaps trussed up for some new culinary experiment. More platters appear, golden rice studded with raisins and toasted almonds. Bowls of thick stew flecked with coriander. Every bite tastes like it should end the meal. But more keeps coming. You chew and swallow and nod politely whenever a servant approaches. At one point, you think you glimpse a tray of tiny stuffed songbirds, though you decide not to look too closely in case your stomach decides this is the final indignity. Historians still argue whether the sheer excess of these banquets was truly appreciated by the diners, or if most simply endured it as a performance of wealth. Judging by the glazed look in your neighbor's eyes, you suspect everyone here is playing the same game of pretending this is ordinary. Remember that damp tunic you left behind. It might have been simpler to wear after all, easier to sneak away. Should the need rise. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But maybe it's for the best. You'd only be searching for excuses to leave before the next course arrived. A servant glides up with a silver basin and a small ewer of perfumed water. You hold out your hands, grateful for the chance to rinse away the sheen of grease. The cool stream sluices across your palms, carrying crumbs and doubt in equal measure. You dry them on a cloth so fine it nearly floats off your lap, then place it carefully back on the tray. The music shifts again. This time, the singer joins in a low, haunting voice that winds through the hall, filling the spaces between flickering lantern shadows. You tilt your head to listen, though you can't make out the words. Perhaps they're about love or loss, or simply about the pleasure of eating until you forget your own name. Remember that moment by the archway, when you almost turned back? You can't help thinking that was your last chance to escape unmarked. You lean back a little, conscious of how the robe tugs across your shoulders. It doesn't quite fit too long in the sleeves, too tight where you need it loose. You wonder if it was meant for someone taller, or simply someone more accustomed to this pageantry. The thought lodges behind your ribs and refuses to budge. The flute resumes its quiet keening. More plates rive slivers of spiced carrot, little pastries filled with what tastes like dates and cream. Your stomach protests in weary disbelief. You take one more bite out of duty rather than hunger, then fold your hands in your lap. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But no one here knows your name anyway. You glance round the hall, trying to fix every detail in your memory. The gilt columns, the drifting perfume, the weary pride in every face. It feels like the final moments of a dream you didn't realize you were having. And you brace yourself, certain there is still more to come. You think you must have reached the limit surely. No one could possibly eat another morsel without rupturing into polite ribbons. But as you shift on your cushion, the servants return, their trays replenished with yet more dishes. You feel something in your spirit wilt a little, like a flag left too long in the rain. Remember the first time you glimpsed the gates of Baghdad. You imagined crossing into a world of wonder. You didn't picture having to survive a labyrinth of tiny, relentless courses. A delicate bowl of lentil soup appears in front of you. Steam coils from the surface, carrying an earthy aroma that mingles with the ever-present rosewater haze. You curl your fingers round the rim, partly for warmth and partly to steady yourself. The liquid is thick, creamy, studded with what you think might be cumin seeds. You lift it to your lips, and the first taste is gentler than you expect, almost like something you'd eat back home if your neighbors were feeling generous. Historians still argue whether this particular dish was a humble nod to the kitchens of the less wealthy or a calculated demonstration that even peasant fare could be elevated into art. You suspect it's both, and you suspect the Abbasid elite liked the duality very much. You sip slowly, trying to savor the warmth all round. The conversations rise and fall in a polite hush. The merchant beside you finally sits aside his parchment to eat, and for a moment you almost feel you're equals to tired strangers sharing a meal too big for either of you to finish. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, But at least you're spared. The pressure of tagging this moment as #blessed. When you set the bowl aside, his servant is already at your elbow to whisk it away. You watch your empty dish vanish into the procession and feel a hollow relief that one small phase has concluded. But the respite is brief. Another server arrives with a stack of fresh flatbreads, their edges singed and fragrant. He lowers them to the table so gracefully you half expect him to disappear in a puff of perfume smoke. Remember that stale bread you brought in your satchel? You'd almost rather have it back, at least it didn't demand you pretend to know which spices were considered refined. You tear off a piece of warm bread, mostly to occupy your hands. Your fingers are slick with steam and oil, and you do your best to look composed. The woman in the ivory veil doesn't spare you a glance, but you're sure she can feel your unease vibrating through the cushions across the hall. A group of dignitaries are watching a performance you hadn't noticed before. A dancer in bright silk scarves, turning in a slow circle that never seems to end. Her hands move in a looping rhythm, tracing patterns in the air. You can't hear the music she dances to, only the whisper of the lute and the occasional trill of the flute, but the effect is hypnotic. You catch yourself staring, transfixed by the slow spiral of her movements. Historians still argue whether these performances were considered more sacred or secular. Some said each gesture was a prayer in motion. Others that it was simply entertainment for those too full to stand. Either way, you can't look away. The servant touches your shoulder lightly, reminding you the bread is not the final course. Another dish appears, soft cheese drizzled with something that gleams amber in the lamplight. You glance at your neighbors, note how they scoop it with the flatbread, and mimic them as best you can. The flavor is sharp, almost grassy, and it sets your teeth on edge in a way that feels oddly bracing. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But that's probably wise. Your screen would only reflect your flushed, bewildered face. You take another small bite, mostly because it seems expected. By now your stomach is a patchwork of conflicting sensations: hunger, satiety, dread. You fold your hands over your belly and close your eyes briefly, letting the lute's soft chords lull you. Remember that moment you nearly fell into the courtyard fountain. You'd almost prefer that mortification to the slow, relentless attention of this room. The music shifts against something minor and plaintive that makes you feel as though the ceiling itself is sighing over your discomfort. A servant pauses, sprinkling rose water across the tables from a delicate vial. The scent clings to your skin and hair, settling into your robe so firmly you suspect it will follow you home. You breathe slowly, determined to appear unruffled, though your heart has been galloping since the first platter arrived. Another dish comes, small stewed chickpeas in a sauce so thick it clings to your spoon. You taste it earthy, faintly sweet, satisfying in a way that makes you ache with the realization you are hundreds of miles from any place you'd call home. Remember your damp tunic. At least it never carried the scent of 15 different dishes. The merchant beside you shifts, sighs, and lifts his cup. For the first time, he seems to notice you truly, and he raises his eyebrows in a silent question. Are you surviving this? You almost laugh. But instead you incline your head in the tiniest acknowledgement. No words pass between you, but for the first time all evening, you feel a little less alone. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but hid in this hole. Nobody would understand its importance anyway. Your hand hovers over the last morsel of chickpeas. You hesitate, then leave it where it is a quiet declaration that you have reached the end of your capacity. A servant appears to clear your plate, and you murmur thanks in a voice that sounds a little steadier than you feel. All around you, the guests are leaning back, shifting their cushions, preparing for whatever ritual comes next. You realize with a kind of tired certainty that the banquet isn't over. Not yet. And somehow, neither are you. The servants melt away with the spent dishes, leaving the table stripped to polished wood for the first time all evening. A hush settles so dense you can feel it pressing into your shoulders. You glance around, expecting perhaps some sign the ordeal has ended, but instead, you catch sight of fresh platters being ranged on a dais near the far archway. Of course, desserts. Remember that first anxious moment by the gate, when you worried you wouldn't be allowed. Inside, you almost wish you'd been turned away. It would have been simpler to sleep in the dust than to endure the slow crescendo of course after course. His servant approaches, bearing a tall ewer chased in silver and blue enamel. He tips it with theatrical care, pouring a stream of liquid, the color of pale amber, into a glass no bigger than your thumb. You accept it with both hands, nodding because you've seen everyone else do the same. It smells of something floral rose, perhaps, and a note of something sharper underneath. You risk a cautious sip. Sweetness floods your tongue, chased by an aftertaste that feels medicinal. You nearly cough but clamp your lips shut in time. Historians still argue whether this cordial was prized more for its taste or its alleged power to soothe an over. Fed barely, as the warmth slides into your throat, you decide it's probably both. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But that's a relief. No chance of your screen lighting up with an alert about your overdue rent while you're pretending you belong among Abbasid nobility. The music drifts into a slower tempo, and a pair of servants set low trays between each cluster of guests. On them sit ranks of sweets so perfect they look unreal. Dense squares dusted in crushed pistachio, coals of pastry glazed in syrup, little domes studded with what appear to be candied violets. You feel your resolve wobble. You watch your neighbors select with delicate fingers, each choice a statement of taste and discernment. You follow their example, picking up a cube that yields under your touch, staining your fingertips in translucent honey. The first bite nearly undoes you, so sweet it tightens your jaw, so rich it obliterates the last vestiges of your appetite. You swallow and set it down, heart fluttering. Remember the stale bread you were carrying when you arrived. You trade every last jewel-toned confection for one mouthful of its plain, predictable blandness. Servants move again, clearing the empties and replacing them with bowls of fresh fruit grapes. Pomegranate seeds gleaming like garnets, slices of melon-nut. Pillars the dawn. You take one grape, hoping a clean burst of juice will revive your senses. But it only makes you more aware of how tired you become. Your spine aches from sitting so long on the low cushion. Your borrowed robe tugs at your neck. Historians still argue whether these feasts were designed to nourish or to test the endurance of the invited. You can't help suspecting it's the latter. The music pauses in the lull. The dignitaries nearest the dais begin to rise. They do so in a choreographed wave, each movement perfectly timed. The rest of the hall follows suit with varying degrees of grace. You hesitate, unsure whether standing now is the right choice, but the merchant beside you lifts his eyebrows, as if in silent encouragement. You brace a hand against the floor and rise, careful to keep your robe from tangling your feet. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But at least you can text your friends to confess that you've forgotten which exit you're supposed to use. Daughters, you stand. The servants come forward with narrow silver basins, one by one. Each guest dips their hands, then accepts a towel so fine it's practically a suggestion. You mimic them, grateful for the chance to wash the syrup from your fingers. Though no ritual can scrub away your fatigue, remember your reflection in the fountain. If you could glimpse yourself now, you suspect you'd look a decade older. When the last of the basins vanish, the hush thickens again. The host himself appears tall, robed in ivory, beard carefully oiled, eyes as cool as the polished tiles. He doesn't speak. He only lifts his hand in a gesture you recognize as dismissal. Or perhaps benediction. You're not sure which. Either way, the message is clear. It's time to go. Relief blooms in your chest, so sudden and bright you almost sway. You join the trickle of departing guests, careful to keep your pace unhurried. No need to betray your eagerness to escape this. Whole of unending refinements. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But here, no one expects you to account for every moment. You pass beneath the archway into the dim corridor. The music recedes to a muffled sigh behind you. You pause, gathering slow breath. The air smells different out here, cooler, tinged with night. Remember the first scent of cinnamon that clung to your tunic? It seems impossibly far away, part of another life. A servant waits at the corridor's end, arms folded, expression unreadable. He gestures for you to follow. You do, your steps growing steadier as the hush of the banquet fades behind you, one foot in front of the other. You remind yourself, just keep walking. The night outside is waiting. You follow the servant through the corridor, your footsteps absorbed by the thick runners stretched across the tiles. Each step feels lighter than the last, as if the banquet's weight is peeling off you one exhausted layer at a time. Your borrowed robe still drapes heavily over your shoulders, but you find you've grown accustomed to its alien softness, its faint perfume of other people's luxury. Remember that damp tunic you abandoned in the changing room? You'd almost rather slip it back on, if only because it belonged to you and no one else. The corridor bends left, then opens into a vestibule dimly lit by a few oil lamps. Here, a row of servants stands waiting behind a polished cedar counter. Each of them watches the departing guests with the same composed patience, hands folded neatly at their waists. You hesitate a moment, unsure whether to approach or simply wait for instruction. The servant who escorted you inclines his head. Nudging you forward, you cross the threshold. Conscious of the hush that settles round your shoulders, a young attendant lifts a ledger bound in pale leather. He scans it without glancing up, his lips moving silently. After a moment, he extends a small woodland token flat, stamped with the same crescent emblem you remember from your first invitation. You accept it, though you have no idea what purpose it serves. Historians still argue whether such tokens were records of attendance or mere souvenirs, proof you had enjoyed the evening without disgrace. You study it, half hoping it will sprout instructions on how to find your way out of this labyrinth. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But at least there's no algorithm here to decide which memories you should treasure and which you should discard. Second attendant steps forward with a bundle of cloth draped over his forearm. With solemn care, he unfolds the original tunic, the one you'd left behind hours ago. It smells faintly of rose water now, a fragile attempt to disguise the mildew that clings stubbornly to the seams. You almost laugh, but your throat is too tight to manage even that. Remember the cinnamon stain you picked up in the bazaar? It's still there, a tiny brown smudge on the cuff. A small proof that no matter how polished the banquet, you've carried your own peculiar history through every archway. The servant bows slightly, inviting you to reclaim what was yours. You slide your arms into the familiar sleeves, the coarse fabric a shock after the silk. The robe slips off your shoulders in a whisper and disappears into the attendant's waiting hands. You feel strangely bereft to let it go, though it was never yours to begin with. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you suspect you'd feel lonelier if it weren't. A final servant appears, carrying your satchel. He sets it gently on the counter. You glance inside, half expecting the stale bread to have vanished in your absence. But no, it's still there, along with the small clutch of coins and the folded scrap of paper you used to jot directions. You lift the satchel and sling it over your shoulder. Its familiar weight settling against your hip like a quiet affirmation that you're once again yourself. Remember your reflection in the courtyard fountain, the face that seemed bewildered by everything. You suspect you look no less bewildered now, but at least you survived. The servant gestures toward an arched doorway draped in a plain linen curtain. Beyond it, you glimpse the night black and cool and waiting. For a moment, you stand, perfectly still, breathing in the hush. Then you step forward, parting the curtain with one hand. Outside, the air feels softer than you expected, as though the city itself is offering consolation for your ordeal. You pause at the top of the steps, blinking at the moonlight spilling across the flagstones. The sky looks enormous after so many hours beneath carved ceilings and gilded screens. Historians still argue whether these banquets truly united guests across every class or merely staged the illusion of togetherness. As you descend the steps, you suspect you've glimpsed a little of both an extravagant generosity that came with a hidden price, a performance no one could ever fully exit unlocked. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but out here, nobody expects you to prove your worth with photographs. You walk across the courtyard, your sandals scuffing softly in the quiet. A fountain murmurs in the shadows, and the last lamps flicker on the colonnades. You touch the woodland token in your palm, wondering whether you'll keep it as proof you are here or throw it away before dawn. Remember the moment you stepped through the outer gates, certain you were doomed. You weren't wrong, but you weren't entirely right either. You reach the far side of the courtyard, where a narrow alley leads back into the maze of the city. The night stretches before you, vast and unknowable, and you take a slow, measured breath. One foot in front of the other. You remind yourself, you've survived the banquet, and now, you're free to find your own way back to something simpler. You step into the alley, the air cooling as you slip from the courtyard's lamplight, for the first time since arriving. You are alone, no servants eyeing your damp tunic, no silent guests gauging your worth in the flick of a gaze. Just the hush of a city settling into night, the soft creak of shutters being drawn, and your own breathing, ragged and relieved. Remember how the bazaar had smelled of cinnamon and sweat. Out here, the air tastes of river damp and old bricks, less perfumed but somehow more honest. You walk slowly, one hand grazing the wall to keep your balance. The alley slopes down in a gradual descent, its paving stones worn to a shine by generations of passing feet. A stray dog lifts its head as you approach, ears flicking in the moonlight. It watches you without suspicion, as though you are merely another harmless curiosity drifting past. You nod at it because nodding feels more dignified than admitting you don't quite know where you're going. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but in this darkness, you'd be too tired to scroll anyway. A small door stands ajar ahead, spilling a wedge of lamplight onto the stones. You pause in the shadows, watching as a servant steps out carrying a tray of spent dishes, their gleaming surfaces reflecting the last scraps of the banquet. He doesn't see you. He only pivots, vanishing. Down another corridor, the door clicks shut behind him, and you're left in the hush again, wondering how long this elaborate machinery of hospitality will keep turning long after you're gone. Historians still argue whether the Abbasid kitchens ran all night to prepare for dawn feasts, or if the last embers were banked in darkness, letting the palace sleep. As you linger in the alley, you imagine those fires low and glowing, attended by weary cooks whose names no ledger ever recorded. You move on, step by careful step, until the alley splits at a crooked junction. One path leads back toward the bazaar you staggered through hours ago. The other climbs into a quarter you don't recognize, where lanterns glimmer like watchful eyes in the gloom. You hesitate, palm sliding over your satchel, feeling the outline of that stale bread still pressed against the cloth. Somehow, its small, stubborn presence steadies you. Remember the first time you touched your invitation? That strip of silk-wrapped parchment had felt like a promise. Now, it feels more like a prank you're only just beginning to understand. You choose the familiar way, the lower path, and soon the smell of spices and tanned leather thickens in the air again. Even at this hour, a handful of vendors linger under creaking awnings, packing their goods into crates. A boy with sleepy eyes tosses the last wilted herbs into a basket. He glances up, curiosity flickering across his face before he turns back to his work. You wonder if he can tell you've come from the great banquet hall, or if you simply look like every other traveler clinging to the edges of the city. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but out here, no one would ask you to prove where you've been. You pause beside a shuttered shop whose wooden sign bears a painted fig. The counter is stacked with empty baskets, each stained from the weight of the day's fruit. You imagine the figs piled high, ripe and bruising under the touch of 100 hands. And for a moment you wish you'd been here instead of at that banquet, just one more anonymous face in the market. A silk robe to betray your awkwardness. Remember, your reflection in the water. You suspect if you looked again now, you'd see something shifted in your eyes, something like resignation or relief. Your feet ache, and when you lift them, the soles of your sandals peel free of the stones with a soft, sticky sigh. You realize how heavy your limbs have grown, as though every plate you sampled has left an invisible burden you'll carry long after you leave this place. Ahead, a crossroads glimmers with two lanterns hung from iron brackets. You step into the pool of light, feeling its warmth seep into your damp tunic. The narrow alleys beyond look identical, but you choose one almost at random, trusting your instincts or maybe just your exhaustion to guide you. Historians still argue whether travelers in Baghdad could ever truly know where they stood, or if the city's streets were meant to bewilder as much as impress. You suspect you're living proof that the confusion was deliberate. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you're grateful for it. If it buzzed now, you might lose the fragile thread of composure you've managed to tie on yourself. You pass a closed bakery, a curl of old yeast and charcoal still clinging to the lintel. The scent makes your stomach flutter weakly, a reminder that, impossibly, you could eat again if you had to. You shake your head, amused at the thought. No more banquets. Tonight, no more ceremonies. Only the quiet promise of the night and the long walk back to wherever you'll rest. Remember that wooden token, smooth against your palm. You squeeze it once, then slip it into your satchel, deciding you'll keep it a little longer. Proof you survived something grander than you ever asked to endure. One foot in front of the other. That's all that's left. The alleyway unfolds into a wider thoroughfare, and for the first time in hours, you feel the press of night air moving freely across your skin. The buildings here lean back from the road as though they, too, are relieved to have survived the day. You pause under a balcony carved with curling vines, its plaster faded by countless seasons. A lantern dangles overhead, swaying gently, casting rippling shadows across the cobbles. Remember the first flicker of dawn you glimpsed from outside the city gates? It seems impossible that was the same day. You've eaten and witnessed and endured. Enough for a week. You walk on, passing a shuttered perfumery whose walls still exhale rose and myrrh. The scent clings to you, mingling with the ghost of lamb and syrup and sweat that your borrowed robe never quite concealed. Your tunic scratches your shoulders, familiar and unwelcome all at once. It's a reminder that no matter how well you played your part in the banquet, you are always destined to end the night alone in the street, searching for a bed you could actually afford. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, But at least you don't have to reply to any messages asking how your evening is going. A stray cat emerges from beneath a wicker cart, blinking slowly before slipping across your path. You watch it vanish into the gloom, thinking that it moves with more assurance than you felt since you arrived. Your own steps feel hesitant, half-measured, as though you're not quite convinced the ground will hold you. Historians still argue whether the Abbasid Caliphate was a golden age of refinement, or merely a thin veneer of a deeper uncertainty. Tonight, you suspect it was both an empire propped up by rituals too elaborate to question, too dazzling to refuse ahead. You spot a row of low lamps marking the edge of what must be a caravanserai courtyard. You drift toward the light, heart, lifting in the quiet hope that you might be close to rest at last. When you arrive, you find the gate half open, watched by a sleepy attendant in a turban askew over one ear. He gives you a single, an interested glance and waves you inside. No scrutiny here. No ritual ablutions or parchment scrolls. Just a place to unburden yourself, however briefly. You step into the courtyard, feeling your shoulders sag as the last traces of the banquet slip from your posture. Remember that reflection in the fountain. It would barely recognize you now slumped, dusty, grateful for nothing more than an unremarkable corner to sleep in. The courtyard is plain, paved with flagstones cracked by years of wagons rolling through. A row of wooden doors lines one side. You pick the first empty niche you see, easing onto the step with a groan that echoes louder than you intended. The attendant doesn't even blink. He's too busy scratching the ear of an enormous dog sprawled at his feet, a creature so relaxed it might be mistaken for a sack of wool. You set your satchel down and rest your hands on your knees, staring at the quiet space. There are no fountains here, no painted ceilings or silver hues, just the soft chorus of insects in the weeds and the low hiss of a brazier cooling in the night air. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but in this courtyard, no. One expects you to perform a version of yourself that doesn't fit. You close your eyes. The afterimages of the banquet still drift behind your lid's gilded platters, mountains of roasted meat. The musicians slow, sighing chords. You wonder if any of the guests still linger in the hall, their conversation dissolving into the hush of too many courses and not enough genuine connection. Historians still argue whether those banquets ever really nourished anyone, or if they were merely another kind of theater way to measure STA. Just in how gracefully you pretended to enjoy excess, you open your eyes again, blinking away the thought. Remember the stale bread in your satchel. You pull it free now, weighing it in your palm. It feels absurdly reassuring. A reminder of the version of you that existed before the night swallowed you whole. You break off a small piece and chew it slowly, grateful for its rough simplicity. The attendant finally looks up. His gaze lingers on your face, then drops to the scrap of bread. He doesn't ask questions. He only nods once, as if to say, "You've come far enough." Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But so is the illusion that you needed it to feel anchored here. You exhale, leaning back against the wall. For the first time, your body feels heavier than your thoughts. You're aware of every bruise, every each a small ledger of your passage through a world that wasn't built for you. But somehow, you endured. Remember the moon over the courtyard, how it gleamed on the flagstones when you first arrived. It's still shining now, indifferent to your exhaustion. You find this comforting. You close your eyes again, knowing you'll have to stand and find a bed eventually. But not yet, for now. You're content to sit in the hush, your satchel resting against your hip, the last bite of bread softening on your tongue. One foot in front of the other, you remind yourself again. And tonight, no one expects you to go further than this. You stay on the low step longer than you mean to, feeling the night seep into your bones, The air is cooler here, washed clean of incense and warm spices. It smells of damp stone, old straw, and something metallic you can't quite name. You breathe it in gratefully. It feels honest, nothing layered in ceremony or sweetness. Remember that moment you first stepped through the banquet hall doors, struck blind by all the gilded splendor. Here, there's nothing to dazzle you, and the relief is as profound as the exhaustion. After a time, the attendant stirs from his half-doze. He gestures with a tilt of his head toward the far corner of the courtyard, where a row of narrow rooms waits in the shadows. You rise, joints popping, and collect your satchel. The bread is gone now, eaten down to the last crumb. You almost wish you'd saved a piece to remind you that simplicity isn't a failing. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but there is something beautiful in knowing you won't be interrupted by any other voices tonight. You cross the flagstones, each step measured to keep your sandals from slapping too loudly. The door he's indicated is plain cedar, the lintel uncarved. You tap your knuckles lightly, though you suspect no one is waiting inside. When you ease the door open, your guess is confirmed. The room is empty, save for a rolled mat, a folded blanket, and a chipped clay pitcher of water. Historians still argue whether these caravanserai rooms were meant to be simple out of necessity, or philosophy a reminder that no matter how far you traveled, you return to the same basics: water, shelter, a place to rest. You think it might be the truest thing you've learned all evening. Remember your reflection in the fountain, uncertain whether you were meant to be there at all. You suspect that version of you would be amazed by how far you've carried yourself. Since then, you set your satchel by the wall and unroll the mat. The straw inside rustles and sighs as it settles flat. When you lay the folded blanket over it, you realize your hands are trembling. You flex your fingers slowly, as if testing whether they still belong to you. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But if you had it, you might be tempted to document this tiny room, proof to yourself that you survived something grander than you ever wished for. You pour a little water into the shallow cup left on the shelf. It's cool against your palm, tasting faintly of clay. Each swallow steadies you, washing away the last trace of syrup clinging to your throat. You set the cup aside and kneel to loosen your sandals. When you finally peel them off, you feel the rawness on your heels, the ghost of every step you took to reach this square of quiet. Remember that silk robe, how it slipped across your shoulders like a second skin. You feel almost grateful you no longer wear it. It was never yours to begin with. You ease down onto the mat, careful not to jostle the pitcher. The straw creaks under your hips, your body sighs. A sound so involuntary you flush in the darkness. You draw the blanket over your chest and stare up at the low rafters, tracing the cracks in the plaster until your eyes blur. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But no one here will measure your worth by how many messages you've answered. Your thoughts drift in loose circles. The banquet, with its endless courses and choreographed rituals, seems impossibly far away, like a vivid tale someone else once recounted. Here, in the plain hush of this ballroom, you feel more yourself than you have since dawn. Historians still argue whether the splendor of the Abbasid palaces outlasted their empires. You suspect the true legacy is this: the way it feels to step from a golden hall into the unremarkable dark and realize you have survived it all. Remember the stale bread, the first taste of something simple after too much richness. This place feels like that, plain, honest, and necessary. You close your eyes. The night presses in softly, not as an enemy, but as a bomb. For the first time, you think you might actually rest. You lie still on the straw mat, the blanket tucked to your chin, listening to the courtyard settle into its slow, rhythmic hush. Each small sound, the creak of the rafters, the distant scuff of footsteps, The sleepy rattle of a cart somewhere beyond the walls feels more real than the entire banquet you've just endured. Remember how you felt when the first servant handed you the invitation, your pulse thrumming with the conviction that you were about to be exposed as an imposter. In this plain room, you almost laugh at how inevitable the dread seemed. You shift, feeling the mat scratch against your shoulder blades, and exhale a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. The air smells of old wood, straw, and the faintest trace of rose water lingering on your tunic. You rub the coarse fabric between your fingertips, oddly comforted by its familiar roughness. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But here, nobody expects an update. Nobody even knows you exist, which is its own peculiar kindness. Your mind drifts back over each moment of the evening, the hush that fell as you entered the hall. The sea of gilded platters glinting in the lantern light, the slow avalanche of dishes that followed. The memory is already softening round the edges, turning from a series of crises into something you can almost admire. Almost. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were designed to honor their guests or simply overwhelm them into submission. You suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle. Each lavish course, a reminder that you were never meant to feel entirely at ease. You reach for your satchel and draw it closer, resting one hand across its shape. It feels reassuringly unchanged. Inside, your few coins, your folded scrap of directions, the small wooden token pressed between your spare tunic and the empty pouch that once held your bread. The weight of it steadies you, proof that you are not swallowed by the banquet spectacle, only brushed by it. Remember your reflection in the courtyard fountain. That startled look in your own eyes. You wonder if you'd recognize yourself now. Softened and a little hollowed by the night's rituals, a breeze sneaks through the crack beneath the door, chilling your toes. You tug the blanket tighter, feeling the mat creak beneath you. In this small room, every movement feels magnified. There are no musicians here to cover the rustle of your breathing. No perfumed servants to distract you with endless ceremony. Only the quiet, the dark, and the steady knowledge that you will rise tomorrow and carry on. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But there is relief in the certainty that nobody will ask how you're feeling or whether you enjoyed yourself. You close your eyes, tracing the night's images in your mind. The woman in the ivory veil lifting a morsel of lamb with such care it seemed almost a benediction. The merchant studying his parchment while you fumbled for the correct spoon. The musician's soft voice curling round the hall like incense. Historians still argue whether the Abbasid elite understood how their rituals affected the outsiders they invited in, whether they ever guessed at the small humiliations. The unspoken relief when the evening finally ended. You doubt they thought much about it. Remember the cinnamon stain that marked your sleeve in the bazaar? It's still there, a quiet, stubborn reminder that you carried your own story through every archway, and no silk robe could hide it. You adjust your weight, feeling the straw mat shift in a chorus of tiny creaks. The blanket slips against your shoulder. You pull it higher and let your gaze drift across the dim rafters. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you no longer mind. Out here, the hours belong to you alone. Your body feels heavy, as if the long day has pressed you into the mat until you've become part of it. You breathe carefully, afraid that if you let go all at once, you'll dissolve into the quiet. Remember your first steps past the city gates. When you believed you were doomed, you weren't entirely wrong, but you weren't entirely right either. You close your eyes and feel the dark press round you like a blanket. Tomorrow, you will rise and slip back into the city. For now, you are exactly where you need to be. You don't know how long you drift in and out of shallow sleep. Each time your eyes flutter open, you half expect to see the gilded arches of the banquet hall or the shifting lantern light gleaming across polished platters. But here, the darkness is simple. Honest, you stare up at the unadorned beam's hand. Feel something in your ease. Remember how your heart thudded when the steward unrolled your invitation, searching it for any excuse to send you away. Lying here, you almost smile at that old fear. You shift on the mat, feeling the straw prickle your shoulder blades. Your body aches in quiet pulses, a reminder that you have carried yourself further than you ever planned. Your stomach is a knot of conflicting sensations, to full, still hungry, confused by the parade of spices and sweets that left their ghost on your tongue. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but here in this room, you have nothing urgent to respond to, no obligations but to rest. A breeze stirs the edge of the blanket, cool enough to raise goosebumps on your arms. You tuck the cloth tight around yourself, grateful for its coarse familiarity. There is no silk here, no shimmering embroidery, but you realize you prefer it this way. The banquet was a story you were never meant to stay inside. This quiet is the place you belong. Historians still argue whether nights like this, when the city's noise receded and left only the hush of private rooms, were the true measure of Abbasid life. You suspect this moment, small and unremarkable, will stay with you longer than any lavish feast. Remember the reflection that startled you in the courtyard fountain. You wonder if you'd recognize your own face now, softened by fatigue, tempered by the knowledge that you survived what you feared most. You draw your satchel closer, fingers brushing the wooden token hidden inside. It feels smoother than you remember, polished by your palm and the long hours you spent clutching it like a lifeline. You don't know if you'll keep it. Some part of you longs to cast it into the Tigris and let it sink. Out of memory. But for tonight, it stays, a proof of your passage. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you feel no urgency to revive it. This silence is gentler than any message you could receive. You breathe slowly. The scents of the day have faded. No more lamb or rosewater. No more incense. Only the faint trace of straw, the mineral tang of the clay pitcher. You turn your face into the blanket and let your body settle deeper into the mat. Remember the first anxious thought that tonight would undo you. It has, but in ways you didn't expect. You are not the same person who stepped through those massive gates. You have been measured, humbled, and somehow made more certain of the worth in simply enduring. You let your eyelids sink close, the darkness behind them richer than any painted ceiling. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But you finally understand it was never what connected you to the world. In the hush, your breathing finds a rhythm, slow, steady, softer than you thought possible. You feel each heartbeat as a small confirmation. You are here. You are enough. And for tonight, that is all you need. Tonight, you've traveled far, from the clamorous bazaar's cinnamon haze to the lantern-lit banquet hall. From borrowed silk robes to the coarse weave of your own tunic again. You've traced every curve of gilded platter and every hush that settled in the wake of too much ceremony. You've carried the ache of too many courses and the quiet disbelief of finding yourself still upping. HT when it was all done. Now, in this simple room with its cracked plaster and creaking mat, you are free to let the weight of the evening slip away. Your breathing slows, each exhale a small surrender to the quiet. The stories you've gathered tonight will wait patiently for you to remember them tomorrow. For now, there is nothing you need to perform. No mask you must wear. Your muscles soften, the last tension unwinding from your neck and shoulders. You feel the mat cradle you, humble and sufficient, as the darkness folds itself around your thoughts. This night asks nothing more of you. No more elegant gestures or careful nods. Just rest. You are safe here, unremarkable and unseen, exactly as you hoped to be when you first stepped through the city gates. You've tasted extravagance and found that simplicity suits you better. The moon has drifted higher now, washing the courtyard in its pale glow, and somewhere beyond these walls, the river keeps flowing, indifferent to all the pageantry it passes. So let yourself drift. Let the hush gather you up. Let the relief of small comforts fill the space the grand displays never could. Your story can rest now, and in the morning you will rise as yourself again whole, and changed in the ways that matter most.
you.